38 factories, 18 months, sold for parts. The fastest industrial collapse in Australian post-war history, executed by a former New Zealand hockey Olympian named Bruce Judge through a company called Ariadne Australia in a $330 million reverse takeover of a company 5 times its size. Read that again. 1/5 the size, bought the giant, sold the giant. The giant was Repco. The same Repco that 20 years earlier had built the V8 engine that put Jack Brabham on top of the Formula One world, the only driver in F1 history to win a world championship in a car of his own name. Built in a tin shed at 87 Mitchell Street, Maidstone, 310 brake horsepower at 8,000 revolutions per minute, 160 kilograms. That engine is still on display in Melbourne. The country that built it doesn't own it anymore. Atlanta does. Before we go any further, hit like and subscribe. Every subscriber keeps these stories alive. Chapter 1. The Tin Shed in Collingwood. Robert Jeffrey Russell was born on the 26th of May, 1892 in Castlemaine, Victoria. His father, Robert Frederick Russell, was an Irish-born school inspector, a man of letters in a country still working out what its own letters look like. His mother, Lucy Coles née Gammon, was Victorian-born. The family moved to Geelong, then to Hawthorn. Jeff, as he was called, was sent to Scotch College in Melbourne. Here's the thing about Jeff Russell. The Australian Dictionary of Biography puts it carefully. Quote, without showing the scholarly aptitude of his father. Read that again. The school inspector's son refused the school inspector's path. He left Scotch College and became a fitter and turner at A.A.H. McDonald and Company in Glenferrie, then a journeyman motor mechanic in Wangaratta, a country town with a workshop, a forge, and the smell of grease at 6 in the morning. Then the war came. On the 22nd of March 1915, Jeff Russell enlisted in the 1st Australian Imperial Force, Gallipoli, the Western Front. Mainly the 6th Field Ambulance, 4 years of carrying other men's broken bodies through mud and through trenches and through artillery barrages he was not allowed to fight back against. He came home in 1919. He was 27 years old. He had spent 4 years stretchering the wounded. And here is the contradiction the official record does not dwell on. A Scotch College son who became a mechanic, a non-combatant who served 4 years at the front line, a man whose father wrote inspectors' reports for a living, who then opened a tin shed in Collingwood in 1922 and called it the Automotive Grinding Company. The Australian Dictionary of Biography describes him. Probing, steel blue eyes and a rigid moral code, became more reserved and aloof as he aged. And further, a perfectionist and ambitious, but not driven by love of money. Read that one again. Not driven by love of money. The man who would build an empire that at its peak ran 38 factories across Australia and would sell that empire in 1945 for £200,000 and retire to a mansion in Lower Plenty was, according to the people who knew him best, not in it for the cash. He was in it for the work. Within 4 years, he had partnered with a man named Bill Ryan. Within 14, he had registered a 4-letter trade name that would survive him by 80 years. Chapter 2. 4 letters. REPCO. In 1924, Russell moved his operation from the Collingwood tin shed to Queensbury Street, Carlton, the centre of Melbourne's motor trade. The smell of grease and the sound of metal on metal rose up and down the street, from Lygon to Elizabeth. Every workshop run by a man who had come back from France and decided to put his hands on engines. In 1926, Russell partnered with a man named Bill Ryan. The new firm was called Replacement Parts Proprietary Limited. The address was Elizabeth Street, Melbourne. The premise was simple. Australian motorists were buying imported cars from Britain, America, France. Those cars broke down. The parts had to come halfway around the world. Russell and Ryan would make the parts in Melbourne. A year later, in 1927, Russell founded a second company alongside the first. He called it Russell Manufacturing Co. Proprietary Limited in North Melbourne. It focused on piston making. It was the most precision work in the entire automotive trade. The tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The metallurgy, a science that British and American manufacturers had spent 40 years perfecting. In 1930, Russell Manufacturing relocated to Burnley Street, Richmond, and the trade name was registered, 4 letters, REPCO, Replacement Parts Company, the name that would, in the next 55 years, become the most recognisable single word in Australian working-class culture, outside the names of beer brands and football clubs. In 1932, the first country branch opened in Hamilton, Victoria, a regional town in the Western District, 400 kilometres west of Melbourne. The Repco branch is still trading on the same street in 2026, 94 years later. Read that again. 94 years on the same street. One country branch, older than Holden, older than Qantas Empire Airways, older than the ABC. In 1936, Russell bought out Bill Ryan. The partnership was over. Russell wanted the company entirely his own. And in 1937, Repco Limited floated on the Melbourne Stock Exchange. Russell as chairman and managing director. A workforce of approximately 500, and, in a detail the company history mentions almost in passing, a woman named Maud Turdish was appointed company secretary. The Australian Dictionary of Biography flags her as among the earliest female company secretaries of an Australian publicly listed company. 1937. 26 years before the Commonwealth Public Service permitted married women to remain in their jobs. But by 1939, Russell's trade name was about to be conscripted. Pistons, bearings, cylinder heads. A war was coming, and Jeff Russell's tin shed was about to be the Australian Air Force's spare parts catalogue. Chapter 3. The Plant in Richmond. September 1939. Britain declared war on Germany. Australia followed within hours. And the Royal Australian Air Force, which had until this moment been a small ceremonial force flying second-hand British equipment, had to become, in the space of 18 months, the third largest air force in the British Commonwealth. That means pilots, that means training aircraft, that means engines, that means parts. The Empire Air Training Scheme, agreed at Riverdale, Ontario, in December 1939, committed Australia to training 50,000 aircrew. The aircraft they trained on were the Avro Anson and the de Havilland Tiger Moth. Both required pistons, both required cylinder heads, both required precision-machined components that, in 1939, could not be reliably imported from Britain because Britain was being bombed. Per Repco's own centenary statement of May 2022, the company supplied pistons for the Avro Anson, the bearings for Ford Vate military trucks, as well as cylinder heads for Tiger Moth aircraft. Read that again. Pistons for the aircraft that trained every Royal Australian Air Force pilot. Bearings for the trucks that moved every Australian Army unit. Cylinder heads for the trainer that produced the men who flew Spitfires over Darwin and Lancasters over Berlin. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records that Russell himself, quote, managed a plant for the Department of Aircraft Production. In spare moments he worked on aircraft cylinder heads at his home, a plant for the Department of Aircraft Production. The specific location is not in the public record. The most probable site is the Burnley Street, Richmond piston factory that Russell had built in 1930, but the ADB confirms the role. The founder of Repco, in his early 50s, ran a Department of Aircraft Production facility through the entire war. The workforce multiplied. In 1937, Repco had approximately 500 employees. By 1942, the International Directory of Company Histories notes that, quote, the company constructed new production facilities, dedicated to its defence manufacturing business. And in 1943, in a single sentence, the ADB delivers without ornament. Russell's elder son Tom was killed in action. F. Read that again. The man who was making the engines for the aircraft that trained Australian pilots lost his own son to an aircraft engine somewhere over Europe. F. The plant kept running. The pistons kept coming off the line. The cylinder heads kept being cast. Down in Launceston, Tasmania, a younger man, Charles McGrath, 29 years old in 1939, was running the Repco subsidiary. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records that his responsibilities, quote, expanded into the production and repair of military vehicle components. 2 men, 2 plants, 1 country at war. The same trade name on every box that left every loading dock. In 1945, the war ended. Jeff Russell fell seriously ill. He resigned from the Repco board. He sold his controlling interest, quote, per the ADB, for £200,000. In today's money, roughly 11 million Australian dollars. He retired to a lower plenty mansion called Amberley. He died on the 19th of April 1946 in Heidelberg of a cerebral tumour. He was cremated at 53 years old. He died 18 months after the war ended. The man who succeeded him would build the empire he never lived to see, and would refuse until the day he died to believe it could ever end. Chapter 4. The Tin Shed That Beat Ferrari. Charles Gulan McGrath, known to almost everyone, even on the factory floor as Dave, was born on the 22nd of November 1910 in Sebastopol, Victoria. He was the 4th child of David Charles McGrath, who was the Federal Member of Parliament for Ballarat from 1913, first as Labor, then as United Australia Party, and Chairman of Committees in the House of Representatives. Before politics, David McGrath had been a storekeeper at Allendale, the son of a politician, educated in Victoria. By the age of 24 in 1935, Dave McGrath was the manager of Repco's Launceston subsidiary, running the Tasmanian operation as Bill Ryan's protégé. The ADB puts it simply, quote, becoming Ryan's protégé, McGrath showed a flair for leadership. In 1953, 7 years after Jeff Russell's death, McGrath succeeded Sir John Story as managing director of Repco. In 1957, he became chairman. The Order of the British Empire followed in 1964. The Knight Bachelor came in 1968 for services to industry and export, Sir Charles McGrath, and the empire began to scale. In 1948, Repco supplied the pistons, the brake components and the control cables for the first Holden 48-215, the FX, which rolled off the line at Fisherman's Bend on the 29th of November of that year. Australia's first locally manufactured passenger car. Every one of them carried Repco parts. In 1961, the Repco Apprenticeship Training Centre opened in Melbourne, the de facto national finishing school for Australian mechanics. Every motor trade in every garage in every suburb of every state had at least one Repco-trained apprentice on the floor by the mid-1960s. And then, in 1964, came the engine. Phil Irving, Australian-born, MBE 1976, the engineer who had designed Vincent motorcycles in England, was working in Aliwal Road, Clapham Junction, London. Repco asked him to design a 2.5-litre Tasman Series V8 based on the Oldsmobile F85 215 cubic inch block. The Primotipo Motorsport Archive records the timeline, pencil to paper on the 15th of March 1964. Drawings completed in September. 53 weeks after the start of drawing, the first engine was running in Australia. Read that again. 53 weeks from drawing to running engine. A timeline Ferrari, Ford and Honda would not have believed possible. Built at 87 Mitchell Street, Maidstone, a tin shed in Melbourne's inner west. General Manager Frank Hallam. Production Manager Peter Hollinger, who would later found the Hollinger transmission empire that still operates today. Production Superintendent Kevin Davies. Cylinder heads cast by Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, the same firm that had cast Repco's wartime aircraft heads. In late 1965, a first-class machinist named Rodway Wolfe joined the team. RMIT night school for 4 years, paid for by Repco. He turned every stud on the engine on a Herbert Capstan lathe. His own words, recorded for the Primotipo archive, quote, "I would normally be boring, but I didn't care. We were winning the World Championship." The engine was designated the Repco RB620, 3-litre, single overhead cam, V8, approximately 310 brake horsepower at 8,000 RPM, 160 kilograms. In 1966, Jack Brabham won the Formula One World Drivers' Championship in the Brabham BT19 powered by the Repco RB620. He became, and remains to this day, the only driver in Formula One history to win the World Championship in a car bearing his own name. In 1967, Dennis Hulme won the Drivers' Championship in the BT24 with the upgraded Repco RB740. Brabham Repco won the Constructors' Championship both years. 38 factories, 1 V8 engine, 1 World Championship, and at the top of it all, a knighted chairman who refused to believe protection wouldn't last forever. Chapter 5. The Empire at 38. By 1970, Repco had reached the peak that no Australian manufacturer in any sector had matched. 38 factories across Australia. Let that number sit for a moment. 38, not 38 stores, not 38 branches. 38 factories, places where raw steel went in one end and finished automotive components came out the other. The Repco Forge at Clayton, Victoria, a joint venture with Kirkstall Forge of Leeds, established in 1952. Hardy Spicer Australia at Burwood, acquired in 1954, driveline components for every car on the road. PBR, Patents Brakes and Replacements, acquired in 1947, brake systems for the entire Holden fleet, the Bayswater plant, the Mulgrave plant, the Maidstone engine shop, the Burwood driveline plant, plants in every state, plants in New Zealand, a national footprint that no parts manufacturer in the country could match. And at the centre of it, Sir Charles McGrath. The Australian Marketing Institute created the annual Sir Charles McGrath Award in 1976. The Herald in 1978 named him as one of Australia's top 10 businessmen. The Australian Industries Development Association made him its president from 1958 to 1960. He chaired the Export Development Council from 1966 to 1969. He sat on the Defence Industrial Committee from 1969 to 1977. And from 1968 to 1974, he served as the Federal Treasurer of the Liberal Party of Australia. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records the role with unusual frankness. Understood as involving twisting arms in business for donations. Twisting arms for donations. 6 years. And the policy he was twisting arms to protect was the policy that had built Repco, the protectionist tariff regime that had been the spine of Australian economic policy since the 1920s, articulated for 2 generations by Sir John Blackjack McEwen, Country Party leader and Trade Minister from 1949 to 1971. McEwen's tariff wall, 60% in some chemical and automotive classifications, was the foundation on which the 38 factories had been built. McGrath was its merchant prince. The 2 men knew each other personally. The ADB records the friendship. Australian manufacturing built behind that wall. Australian motorists paying inflated prices for locally made parts. Australian voters subsidising, through every car they bought, every component they replaced. The 38 factories that employed approximately 15,000 of their fellow citizens. The ADB on McGrath. Nominated by the Herald in 1978 as one of Australia's top 10 businessmen, McGrath remained strenuously opposed to market liberalisation. And here's the thing about the workforce that ran the 38 factories. They were not the Anglo-Saxon Melbourne business establishment that ran the boardroom. They were the Italian families of Brunswick and Coburg, the Greek families of Oakley and Clayton, the Yugoslav families who had come in the post-war wave, the Lebanese families who began arriving in the 1970s, the men and women who stood on the Clayton forge floor in the heat, who ran the Maidstone engine line, who packed the Bayswater dispatch bay. Their names are not in the official archive. Their stories are not in the Australian Dictionary of Biography. They worked 30 years on the line and retired and went home and did not write memoirs. But the engine that beat Ferrari was built by their hands, and on the 18th of July, 1973, at 7 o'clock in the evening, a man named Gough Whitlam appeared on national television, and the 38th factory began to die before it had finished being built. Chapter 6. The Cost of the Empire. Here's what nobody on the McGrath board wanted to admit, even as the Whitlam tariff cut landed on their desks the next morning. The empire had stopped being an empire of pistons and brakes and drivelines. It had become, through the 1970s, an empire of whatever could be bought. Repco branched into bicycles. The Repco bicycle, every Australian kid in the 1970s knew the brand. Repco branched into electrical components. Repco branched into hardware. Repco branched into paint. The ADB on McGrath, quote, "By temperament, a merchant rather than technician." The merchant was now running an industrial conglomerate whose product range had no internal logic. Pistons, brakes, drivelines, forgings, bicycles, electrical components, hardware, paint. 9 product categories, 38 factories, 15,000 employees. Repco's racing engines continued to win races through the late 1960s. The Repco V8 in various configurations powered Australian Grand Prix and Tasman Series cars from 1965 through 1969, including at the Bathurst Easter meeting, which was held on the Mount Panorama circuit in those years before the modern October Bathurst 1000 became the country's signature touring car race. And then, in 1968, the Ford Cosworth DFV, designed in England, financed by Ford, produced 410 brake horsepower. The Repco RB740 produced approximately 340. The Gap was 100 horsepower. The Brabham program wound down by 1969. The tin shed at Maidstone went back to making components for Holden. In 1967, McGrath stepped down as managing director. He remained part-time chairman until 1980, director until 1981. The succession was managed. The board was Melbourne establishment. The Liberal Party, federal treasurer, kept arm-twisting for donations until 1974. And on the floor, at Bayswater, at Clayton, at Maidstone, at Burwood, the migrant workers kept running the lines. The Italian families, the Greek families, the Yugoslav families. The conditions were what 1960s and 1970s. Australian heavy industry conditions were forge work, foundry fumes, the metal dust in the lungs that nobody measured, the early retirements that nobody documented, the deaths in the 60s that the coroner recorded as cardiac arrests, but the families knew were 40 years of solvent and resin and forging fume. The empire was now bigger than the family that built it. The empire was run by a federal Liberal Party treasurer who lobbied for the very tariffs the empire depended on to survive. The empire had 9 product lines and no industrial logic. And on the 18th of July 1973, the country that had built 38 factories under protection found out that protection was about to be cut by a quarter, overnight. Chapter 7. The country that cracked itself open. 18th of July 1973. 7 o'clock in the evening. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam appears on national television and announces a uniform 25% reduction in all import tariffs. Effective midnight. The decision had been drafted in secret over 3 weeks by a committee of 6 men chaired by Alf Rattigan, the head of the Tariff Board. Cabinet had not been consulted in any detail. The industries affected had not been warned. Chemical sector tariffs at the time had reached 60% in some classifications. Automotive component tariffs were in the same range. The wall that had protected Repco and every Australian parts manufacturer from European, American and Japanese imports was cut by a quarter overnight. Alex Milmal, writing in The Conversation on the 50th anniversary in July 2023, summarised the consequence. Quote, "Over the next 7 years, manufacturing employment fell by 80,000. Read that again. 80,000 jobs. 7 years. One Tuesday evening announcement. In December 1983, the Hawke government floated the Australian dollar. Imported parts now traded at global prices, not at protected prices. The Australian manufacturer's last cost advantage, the favourable exchange rate that had cushioned the 1973 cut, evaporated. In 1984 and 1985, Senator John Button, Industry Minister in the Hawke Cabinet, drafted the Motor Industry Development Plan. The Button Plan favoured tariff reductions designed to consolidate Australian car manufacturing from 5 makers to 3. The chemical sector, the textile sector, the footwear sector, the automotive component sector all face the same arithmetic. Build it cheaper, import it, or close. Repco, built on the McEwen-era tariff regime, now face global pricing on every imported component. The forging plant at Clayton could not compete with Korean forgings. The piston plant could not compete with Japanese pistons. The driveline plant could not compete with Mexican drivelines. And on the 12th of May 1984, at his Phillip Island cattle farm, Cows, Sir Charles McGrath died, aged 73. Estate sworn for probate at $1,166,438 Australian dollars. He died believing, until the last conversation, until the last board meeting, until the last twist of an arm, that protection would last forever. It would not. And in 1985, a former New Zealand hockey Olympian named Bruce Judge walked into a Brisbane boardroom and announced he was buying a company 5 times the size of his own. Chapter 8. 330 million. Bruce Judge was born in Auckland. He had represented New Zealand at hockey at the Olympic Games. He had worked at Briley Investments, the New Zealand corporate raider firm that had pioneered the hostile takeover in the Australasian market in the 1970s. In 1979, Judge left Briley with a colleague named Paul Collins. Their start-up capital came from a Christchurch timber merchant named Cyril Smith. They built up through a series of acquisitions: Bunting, a New Zealand broom and brush company, then Odlands, then Winstones. In June 1982, Bruce Judge left his wife Gillian Eldridge and his 4 children. He moved to Brisbane. He bought into a Queensland quarrying company called South Pine Quarries, approximately 28% of it, for approximately 28 million Australian dollars. He renamed the company. He called it Ariadne Australia. In 1985, Ariadne moved on Repco. The New Zealand Herald, in a retrospective profile of Judge, described the deal in its own words. Quote, "In a classically convoluted deal, each took 19.9% stakes in the other. But eventually, Ariadne turned the tables with a bold $330 million takeover of the company, 5 times its size." Read that again. A New Zealand corporate raider, with a company 1/5 the size of Repco, took control of Repco. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. Bruce Judge was named Australian Businessman of the Year in 1986 for the Repco deal. The Australian business establishment, the same establishment that had knighted Sir Charles McGrath in 1968, gave its most prestigious annual award to the man who was, at that moment, dismantling McGrath's empire. The breakup was fast. The International Directory of Company Histories records it. Quote, "Under Ariadne, Repco's breakup was accelerated. By 1986, Repco had shed its manufacturing operations altogether and was regrouped around its automotive parts distribution network. 38 factories, 18 months, sold for parts. The Bayswater plant, the Clayton Forge, the Maidstone engine shop, the Burwood driveline plant, the Hardy Spicer plant, the PBR plant, the 8 regional component plants, the 2 New Zealand plants, the 7 Sydney plants, the forging works, the bicycle plant, the electrical plant, sold, closed, stripped for assets. Rodway Wolfe, the first-class machinist who had turned every stud on the engine that won the 1966 World Championship, watched the Maidstone plant close. The Herbert Capstan lathe he had stood at, paid through RMIT Night School by Repco, sold for scrap. And then, in October 1987, the crash. Ariadne's cross-shareholdings collapsed. Judge Corp, Impala Pacific Hong Kong, Euronational, Coupe, Reneuf Corp. The New Zealand Herald recorded the result. Quote, Ariadne's 52,000 shareholders and those in its related companies saw virtually all their wealth wiped out. 52,000 shareholders wiped out. In 1988, Bruce Judge presided over a then record Australian corporate loss of 640 million Australian dollars, 715 million New Zealand dollars. He was forced out by the National Companies and Securities Commission under threat of investigation. And Repco, what was left of it, the distribution network without the factories that had supplied it, was sold to Pacific Dunlop at an undisclosed price that the trade press of the time described as a fire sale. John Guth, Pacific Dunlop's managing director, was named Australian Businessman of the Year in 1988. The same award Judge had won in 1986 for taking Repco, the destroyer and the buyer. The same award, the same company. Pacific Dunlop renamed it Pacific Automotive, delisted Repco from the Australian Securities Exchange. From 1988, the Repco that ran 38 factories was over. The Repco that survived was a distribution network, and the next 25 years were a slow march from Pacific Dunlop to Melbourne to a boardroom in Atlanta, Georgia. Chapter 9. The Long Walk to Atlanta. In 1988, Pacific Dunlop took ownership of what remained. The first dual-format consumer and trade store opened in New Zealand the same year. The trade counter business, selling parts directly to mechanics, was kept on. The retail business, selling parts directly to home garage owners, was expanded. In 1991, Pacific Dunlop acquired Ashdown, an electrical parts specialist. In 1996, the dual-format store concept launched in Australia. In 1998, the acquisition of APCO, a New Zealand trade chain, added another 40 stores. In 2000, the Moto Specs performance brand launched. By 2001, Pacific Dunlop's share price had fallen to $1.25 Australian. The US-based Shamrock Holdings, the investment vehicle of the Roy E. Disney family of the Walt Disney Company, moved to force restructuring. Pacific Dunlop announced the sale of Pacific Automotive and South Pacific Tires. A management buyout completed. The business was renamed Automotive Parts Group. In October 2003, the Automotive Parts Group renamed itself Repco, restoring the trade name that had been buried inside Pacific Automotive for 15 years, and relisted on the Australian Securities Exchange and the New Zealand Stock Exchange. In December 2006, CCMP Capital, later renamed Unitas Capital, a New York-based private equity firm, acquired all the shares. Repco delisted from the ASX again. 3 years later, in 2009, the business was renamed Exego Group, and on the 5th of January 2012, by press release issued from Atlanta, Georgia, Genuine Parts Company announced it had completed the purchase of a 30% stake in Exego Group, approximately $150 million in cash. On the 11th of March 2013, GPC filed a Form 8K with the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, announcing a definitive agreement to acquire the remaining 70%. On the 2nd of April 2013, the deal was completed. The 8K filing recorded the figures, completed the purchase of the remaining 70% stake of Exego Group for approximately $650 million in cash and the assumption of approximately $160 million in net debt, effective April 1st, 2013. Read that again. $650 million in cash, $160 million in assumed net debt. Total purchase price, approximately $800 million. Tom Gallagher, GPC's chairman and chief executive at the time, said, "The Exego team exceeded our expectations for meeting the growth and earnings thresholds outlined in our original agreement. 100% ownership of their company best positions us to participate in the ongoing and significant growth opportunities in the Australasian aftermarket." The cycle was complete. 85 years after Jeff Russell registered the four-letter trade name in Burnley Street, Richmond, the company that bore it became a wholly owned subsidiary of an Atlanta-listed corporation. And in 2026, the company that beat Ferrari, Ford and Honda at their own game in 1966 was a wholly owned subsidiary of an Atlanta-listed corporation whose chief executive had just been offered a target package of nearly $8 million. Chapter 10. $7.95 million. Genuine Parts Company. Founded 1928. The founder was a man named Carlisle Fraser, who bought a single Atlanta business called the Motor Parts Depot for $40,000. First-year sales, $75,000. 6 employees. In 2026, Genuine Parts Company has approximately 63,000 employees globally. It owns Napa Auto Parts, approximately 6,700 stores across North America. It owns Motion, an industrial automation business. It owns Alliance Automotive Group, a major European parts distributor. And it owns GPC Asia Pacific, the Melbourne subsidiary that owns Repco. The headquarters is the Wildwood Office Park, Atlanta, Georgia. Chief Executive Officer, since the 3rd of June 2024, is William P. Stengel II, known as Will Stengel. He was named President in January 2021, Chief Operating Officer in January 2023, and President and Chief Executive on the 3rd of June 2024, succeeding Paul D. Donohue. His 2024 target compensation package, disclosed in GPC's Form 8K filing with the SEC in April 2024, was $7,950,000. Base salary, $1 million. Short-term incentive target, 145% of base. Long-term incentive target, $5.5 million. Let that number sit for a moment. $7.95 million target in 1 year. In 1945, Jeff Russell, the founder of Repco, received approximately £200,000 for the sale of his entire controlling interest in the company. In today's money, roughly 11 million Australian dollars. Will Stengel's 2024 target package, converted at prevailing exchange rates, exceeds, in a single year, what Jeff Russell received for selling his entire company. GPC Asia Pacific is based in Melbourne. Group Chief Executive, Rob Cameron. Chief Executive of the Automotive Division, Repco, Napa, Rare Spares, Sparesbox, AMX, is Wayne Bryant. The Australian and New Zealand workforce is approximately 4,000 to 5,000. Repco stores number about 320, according to the Australian homepage, more than 400 in GPC's trade statements, and around 560 across Australia and New Zealand by industry estimate. Australian manufacturing footprint is effectively zero. In August 2020, Repco signed a 5-year naming rights deal with Supercars Australia for the Bathurst 1000. Wayne Bryant said at the time, "It is two iconic brands in one amazing partnership." Repco has a long history in motorsport, and aligning with Australia's most famous race was an opportunity we couldn't pass up. The Repco Bathurst 1000 is the country's biggest motor race, named after the company that no longer manufactures anything in the country it sponsors. Walk into the F1 exhibition in Melbourne today and you will find a glass case. Inside is the Brabham BT19, the car that beat the world in 1966. Repco owns it, or what's left of Repco does. Chapter 11. What 38 factories built. Stand in front of the glass case at the F1 exhibition in Melbourne. Melbourne today, the Brabham BT19 sits there, restored, in the colours it wore at Reims in July 1966. The cowl says Brabham, the engine block says Repco, the plaque says owned by GPC Asia Pacific Melbourne, which is the Australian subsidiary of Genuine Parts Company, Atlanta. The car is 60 years old this year. The men who built it, Phil Irving, Frank Hallam, Peter Hollinger, are mostly gone. Rodway Wolfe, the first-class machinist who turned every stud on the engine, is in his 80s and still writes about it for the Promotopo archive. Of the 38 factories that built the tooling that built that engine, not a single one remains. Lesson 1. The empire that built the engine doesn't get to keep it. Repco built the BT19. Repco doesn't own its own past, a US corporation does. Industrial capability is durable. Ownership is not. The men in the Maidstone tin shed who turned the studs on the engine that beat Ferrari, Ford and Honda did not work for Atlanta. They worked for a country. The country is no longer the owner. The country never had the option to remain the owner. Once Jeff Russell took the check in 1945, every subsequent generation of Repco belonged to whoever the global automotive industry was consolidating around. Lesson 2. Diversification. Without discipline is just slow suicide. The 1970s drift into bicycles, electrical components, hardware, paint and forging erase the focus that built Repco. By 1985, when Bruce Judge made his move, Repco was a conglomerate that no one could defend, not the board, not the unions, not the country. Sir Charles McGrath had built an empire on protection and refused, until he died in 1984, to believe protection wouldn't last forever. The protection ended at midnight on the 18th of July, 1973. The empire took 12 more years to notice. By the time Bruce Judge walked into the boardroom, the breakup was inevitable. He simply executed what the board, in private, knew was coming. Lesson 3. The raider is not the villain. The raider is the symptom. Bruce Judge did not destroy Repco's manufacturing. He capitalised on the fact that Repco's manufacturing had already been made indefensible by the McEwen-era protectionism that built it, by Whitlam's 25% cut that exposed it, by Button's plan that finished it, by the McGrath-era assumption that the country owed Repco its existence. Judge merely dismantled what was no longer defensible. The deeper villain is the assumption that protection lasts forever and the country that did not plan for its end. Bruce Judge was named Businessman of the Year in 1986 for the takeover. John Goff was named Businessman of the Year in 1988 for the fire sale acquisition. The same award, the same company, the destroyer and the buyer. The Melbourne establishment that handed out the awards had, by the end of the decade, lost the empire they were applauding. The BT19 is still in the glass case. The cowl says Brabham, The engine block says Repco. The men who turned the studs are in their 80s. The country that built the engine no longer owns the company that owns the engine. Of the 38 factories, not a single one remains. If it's Repco, it works. The engine survives. The country that built it is somewhere else.